A woman walks alone by the edge of a tranquil river, unaware that she is being watched by the most powerful being on Olympus. Zeus, the king of the gods, known for his insatiable thirst for mortal conquests, had just spotted Leda, the queen of Sparta, whose beauty rivals that of the immortals. But this time, his approach would not be as man or god. It would be through one of the most audacious and controversial transformations in Greek mythology. What happened that day on the banks of the Eurotas River would forever change the destiny of kings, heroes, and the Trojan War itself. From the heights of Mount Olympus, Zeus observed the mortal world with all-seeing eyes. Among the golden clouds and marble palaces where the gods celebrated their eternal banquets, the king of sky and thunder had a privileged view of every corner of Greece. That particular morning, his gaze stopped at Sparta, the warrior city known for its indomitable soldiers and iron discipline. But it was not military strength that captured his divine attention. It was a woman. Leda, the queen of Sparta, wife of King Tyndareus, walked through the palace gardens with a grace that made even the muses pale. Her dark hair fell in waves over her shoulders. Her face possessed the serenity of someone who knew her place in the world, and her royal bearing was undeniable. Zeus had seen her before, of course. He had watched her marriage to Tyndareus, witnessed the birth of her children, been present for her life as a virtuous and dedicated queen. Leda was not like other women he had pursued. She was not vain or ambitious. She was genuinely happy in her mortal life, devoted to her family, respected by her people. And perhaps, precisely because of this, Zeus desired her with an intensity that even he did not fully understand. The supreme god had an extensive history of mortal conquests. Europa, Danae, Alcmene, Semele, the list was endless. Each had been approached differently, with Zeus transforming himself into a bull, golden rain, mortal husband, or divine flames. His creativity for seduction was as unlimited as his power. But Leda represented a particular challenge. She was watched, protected, and above all, genuinely in love with her husband. Zeus knew he needed a different plan, something that would disarm her natural defenses, something that would appeal to her compassionate nature rather than any desire. The obsession began to grow in the god's heart. Day after day, he watched Leda perform her daily activities. He saw her supervise the palace, educate her children, walk through the gardens, and especially enjoy moments of solitude on the banks of the Eurotas River, where she would go to reflect in the afternoons. It was there, in that space of tranquility and vulnerability, where Zeus saw his opportunity. If you're enjoying this mythological story, leave the word SWAN in the comments and subscribe to the channel for more fascinating tales of gods and mortals. The history of Zeus and his transformations was as old as time itself. Since the dawn of the Olympian reign, when Zeus and his siblings overthrew the Titans and established their dominion over heaven and earth, the king of the gods had demonstrated an inability to remain faithful to his wife, Hera. It was not merely lust that drove him, though that was certainly part of it. There was something deeper, more complex in Zeus's psychology. Some ancient philosophers suggested it was his desire to spread divinity throughout the mortal world, to create heroes and demigods who would bridge the gap between Olympus and earth. Others believed it was simply the arrogance of absolute power, the belief that he could take whatever he desired without consequence. Hera, his sister and wife, the goddess of marriage and family, suffered immensely with each betrayal. Her rage was legendary, and while she could not directly punish Zeus, she took her vengeance on his lovers and their offspring. Io had been transformed into a cow and tormented by a gadfly across the world. Semele had been incinerated when tricked into asking Zeus to reveal his true divine form. Callisto had been turned into a bear. The pattern was clear and brutal. To be loved by Zeus was to invite catastrophe. Yet Zeus never stopped. His transformations became increasingly creative, almost as if he were challenging himself to find new ways to seduce mortals. He had become a bull for Europa, carrying her across the sea to Crete. He had become golden rain to reach Danae, imprisoned in a bronze chamber. He had taken the form of Amphitryon to deceive Alcmene, resulting in the birth of Heracles. Each transformation served a purpose, was tailored to the specific circumstances and nature of his target. But why did Zeus feel this compulsion? Some texts suggest that the god, despite his power, felt a profound loneliness. Immortality meant watching civilizations rise and fall, seeing mortals live their brief, intense lives, while he remained unchanged for eternity. Perhaps in these unions with mortals, Zeus sought to experience something of that ephemeral human existence, that passion that burns brightly precisely because it is finite. Or perhaps, as many believed, it was simply the nature of power to corrupt absolutely, and Zeus, with unlimited power, was the ultimate example of this corruption. His brother Poseidon shared similar tendencies, and even his son Apollo had his share of tragic love affairs. The divine family of Olympus was dysfunctional in ways that reflected and amplified human flaws. As Zeus watched Leda day after day, he knew that Hera would eventually discover this new obsession. She always did, but that knowledge did nothing to diminish his desire. If anything, it added an element of urgency to his planning. The plan began to take shape in Zeus's mind with the careful calculation of a master strategist. He had fought and won a war against the Titans, had established order in the cosmos, had distributed domains among the gods. He was not merely powerful, he was cunning. For Leda, a direct approach would never work. She was too devoted to Tyndareus, too content in her role as queen and mother. She would reject any advance from a stranger, no matter how handsome or charming. Even if Zeus appeared as a god in all his glory, she might resist out of fear or loyalty. No, this required something different, something that would bypass her rational defenses entirely. Zeus studied Leda's habits with the patience of a predator. He noticed that every few days in the late afternoon, she would walk alone to a secluded spot on the banks of the Eurotas River. It was her moment of peace, away from the demands of palace life, away from the noise of children and servants, away from the political machinations of the court. She would sit on a smooth rock by the water's edge, sometimes trailing her fingers in the current, sometimes simply staring at the flow of the river as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The location was perfect, isolated enough that no guards or attendants followed her, yet not so remote that her absence would be noticed for the brief time Zeus needed. The question was, what form should he take? Zeus considered his options carefully. He could become a wounded soldier, appealing to her compassion. But a strange man, even injured, might frighten her away. He could become another woman, perhaps a traveler in distress. But that seemed too complicated, too many variables. Then, watching the river one afternoon, Zeus saw a pair of swans gliding gracefully across the water. Their white plumage caught the golden light of the setting sun, their long necks curved in elegant arcs, their movements perfectly synchronized. They were beautiful creatures, symbols of grace and purity in Greek culture. More importantly, they were non-threatening. A swan would not frighten Leda. A swan in distress would compel her natural compassion. A swan was perfect. But Zeus added another element to his plan, one that showed his manipulative genius. He would not simply appear as a swan seeking help. He would create a scenario, a drama that would naturally draw Leda in and lower all her defenses. He would appear as a swan being pursued by an eagle, fleeing for its life, desperate for protection. And he, Zeus, would also be the eagle, creating the threat from which he would then seek refuge. It was elaborate, theatrical, and perfectly designed to trigger Leda's protective instincts. The day arrived with deceptive tranquility. Sparta awakened as it always did, with the sounds of soldiers training in the agoge, merchants setting up their stalls in the marketplace, and servants bustling through the palace corridors. The sun rose over the Taygetus Mountains, casting long shadows across the fertile valley where the city had been built. The air carried the scent of olive groves and the distant sea. Leda woke beside Tyndareus in their royal chambers. The king was already stirring, preparing for a day of meetings with his military commanders. Sparta was always preparing for something, always vigilant against potential threats. Tyndareus was a good king, respected by his people, known for his wisdom and fair judgment. He was also a good husband, attentive to Leda's needs, proud of their children. Their marriage was considered exemplary, a model for Spartan nobility. After breakfast, Leda attended to her duties. She met with the palace steward to discuss provisions for an upcoming festival. She spent time with her daughter Clytemnestra, teaching her the skills she would need as a future queen of some other city. She reviewed reports from the palace weavers and approved new designs for ceremonial garments. It was the routine work of royalty, important but often tedious. By late afternoon, Leda felt the familiar need for solitude, for a brief escape from the constant demands on her attention. She informed her attendants that she would take her customary walk to the river and wished to go alone. They were accustomed to this request and did not question it. Leda changed into a simpler chiton, left her jewelry aside, and walked through the palace gardens toward the path that led to her favorite spot on the Eurotas. The river was particularly beautiful that afternoon. The water flowed clear and steady, reflecting the blue sky above. Willow trees lined the banks, their drooping branches creating curtains of green that rustled softly in the breeze. Birds sang in the foliage, and dragonflies darted across the water's surface. Leda found her usual rock, smooth from years of river flow, and settled onto it with a sigh of contentment. She closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face, listening to the peaceful sounds of nature. For these few moments, she was not a queen, not a mother, not a wife with responsibilities. She was simply Leda, a woman enjoying a moment of peace. The tranquility shattered with the sound of wings beating frantically overhead. Leda's eyes flew open just in time to see a magnificent white swan descending rapidly toward the river, its flight erratic and desperate. Behind it, a massive eagle pursued with predatory intent, talons extended, its harsh cry echoing across the water. The swan's panicked honking filled the air as it dove toward where Leda sat, clearly seeking refuge. Without thinking, acting purely on instinct, Leda stood and opened her arms as the swan reached her. The creature was enormous up close, its wingspan nearly as wide as she was tall. It crashed into her embrace with surprising force, its powerful wings wrapping around her, its long neck curving against her shoulder as if seeking comfort. The swan's heart pounded against her chest, its entire body trembling with what seemed like genuine terror. The eagle circled once overhead, released another piercing cry, then flew off toward the mountains, apparently conceding this particular hunt. Leda held the swan close, murmuring soothing words as she would to a frightened child. The bird's soft plumage was incredibly white, almost luminous in the afternoon light, and felt silky beneath her fingers. Gradually, the swan's trembling subsided, but instead of pulling away, seeking the safety of the river, the creature remained in her arms. Its dark eyes, surprisingly intelligent and expressive, gazed into hers. And in that moment, something changed. The air around them seemed to thicken, to pulse with an energy that had nothing to do with the natural world. Leda felt it, but did not understand it. The swan's embrace became less fearful and more deliberate. Its long neck curved around her in a way that was no longer seeking protection, but offering intimacy. Leda tried to step back, confused by the sudden shift, but her feet would not move. What happened next has been debated by scholars, poets, and philosophers for thousands of years. The ancient texts are deliberately vague, using euphemisms and poetic language that obscure the literal truth. Some versions say Zeus revealed himself in that moment, transforming before her eyes into his true divine form. Others insist he remained in swan form throughout. Some accounts suggest Leda was complicit, seduced by the god's charm. Others paint a darker picture, using language that suggests force, violation, a complete absence of choice. What is certain is that something profound and irrevocable occurred on that riverbank, something that would echo through generations. Leda returned to the palace as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. She walked slowly, her chiton slightly disheveled, her hair coming loose from its pins. Her mind felt fragmented, unable to fully process what had transpired by the river. Had it truly happened? Had a god really appeared to her in the form of a swan? Or had she somehow fainted in the heat, experienced some kind of fever dream? But the marks on her skin, the ache in her body, the lingering scent of something not quite animal and not quite human, these were real. Her attendants noticed her state when she entered the palace, but attributed it to the heat or perhaps a stumble on the rocky path. They helped her to her chambers, brought water and fresh clothing, asked if she needed the palace physician. Leda declined everything, sending them away with assurances that she was simply tired and needed rest. But rest would not come. She bathed, trying to wash away the feeling of divine presence that still clung to her skin. She changed her clothes, arranged her hair, composed her face into the serene mask she showed the world. When Tyndareus came to their chambers that evening, she greeted him as always, with affection and warmth. And that night, she lay with her husband, as was their custom, their intimacy as comfortable and familiar as it had been throughout their marriage. But Leda knew, with a certainty that went beyond rational thought, that something impossible had occurred. Inside her womb, two different seeds had been planted on the same day. One divine, one mortal. The biological impossibility of it should have been laughable, but Leda did not laugh. She felt the truth of it in her bones, felt the dual nature of what was growing inside her. In the days and weeks that followed, Leda tried to convince herself it had been a dream, a momentary madness. She resumed her duties, attended festivals, played with her children, made love to her husband. But when the signs of pregnancy became undeniable, when her body began to change in ways that defied natural explanation, she could no longer deny what had happened. She was carrying children conceived by two different fathers in the same day. The palace physician who examined her was baffled by certain aspects of her condition, but attributed everything to the mysteries of childbirth. Tyndareus was delighted at the prospect of more children, never suspecting that not all of them would be his. Only Leda carried the terrible knowledge, the secret that grew heavier with each passing day. The pregnancy progressed unlike any other Leda had experienced. Her body felt different, as if it were accommodating something more than merely mortal. She had strange dreams of Olympus, of golden halls and divine voices, of swans and eagles, and a laughing god who never showed his face. There were days when she felt strong, almost supernaturally vital, filled with an energy that seemed to come from beyond herself. Other days, she felt crushed by the weight of what she carried, both physically and emotionally. The palace women whispered among themselves about how different this pregnancy seemed, but they attributed it to the queen's age or perhaps the blessing of Artemis, goddess of childbirth. When the time came for delivery, even the most experienced midwives were unprepared for what they witnessed. Leda's labor was long and difficult, her screams echoing through the palace corridors. Tyndareus paced anxiously outside the chamber, as was the custom for fathers, forbidden from witnessing the birth itself. And then, in the flickering lamplight of the birthing room, as the midwives worked and prayed, something extraordinary happened. Leda did not deliver babies in the normal way. Instead, her body expelled two large eggs, each nearly the size of a small melon, with shells that gleamed with an otherworldly luster. The midwives gasped, stepping back in shock and fear. Never in all their years of experience had they seen anything like this. Some wanted to flee, convinced that witchcraft or divine curse was at work. But the chief midwife, an old woman who had delivered half the nobility of Sparta, approached the eggs with cautious wonder. They were warm to the touch, pulsing with life. She wrapped them carefully in soft wool and placed them near the brazier to keep them warm. For 2 days, the eggs remained intact while Leda recovered from the ordeal. The palace was in turmoil. Rumors spread despite attempts to contain them. Some said the queen had been cursed. Others whispered of divine intervention. Tyndareus was kept informed, but was uncertain how to respond to such an unprecedented situation. He consulted oracles and priests, seeking explanation and guidance. Then, on the 3rd day, the eggs began to crack. The first egg split open to reveal 2 infants, a girl of such extraordinary beauty that even as a newborn, her features seemed touched by divine perfection, and a boy whose eyes already showed the fierce intelligence of his immortal heritage. These were Helena and Polydeuces, children of Zeus. The second egg hatched to reveal another girl and boy, Clytemnestra and Castor, children of Tyndareus, mortal through and through, though no less beloved for it. Helena grew in a way that marked her as different from the very beginning. While her siblings developed at normal rates, Helena seemed to mature more quickly in some ways, more slowly in others. Her beauty was not just remarkable, it was unsettling, almost supernatural. By the age of 5, grown men would stop in the street to stare at her, and by 10, her appearance caused discord wherever she went. Other children were jealous, other women resentful, and men of all ages found themselves inappropriately drawn to her. Leda watched her daughter with a mixture of maternal love and growing dread. She recognized Zeus's mark on Helena, saw how the divine blood manifested not just in physical beauty, but in a kind of gravitational pull that drew chaos and desire wherever the girl went. Helena herself seemed unconscious of the effect she had on others, which somehow made it worse. She was a sweet child, curious and affectionate, who could not understand why other girls did not want to play with her or why their mothers looked at her with such suspicion. The first real crisis came when Helena was 12 years old. Theseus, the legendary king of Athens, already an old man by then, but still powerful and famous, came to Sparta ostensibly to meet with Tyndareus about political matters. But his true purpose became clear when he saw Helena. He was instantly obsessed, convinced that such beauty could only be meant for a hero of his stature. That night, Theseus abducted Helena from the palace, carrying her off to Attica despite her status as a child. The kidnapping nearly triggered a war. Leda was devastated, blaming herself for the curse that Zeus had placed on her daughter. Castor and Polydeuces, Helena's twin brothers, rode out immediately to rescue their sister. They found her in Attica, guarded by Theseus's supporters, and took her back by force. The incident was hushed up as much as possible to preserve Helena's reputation, but the damage was done. Everyone now knew that Helena of Sparta was worth fighting over, worth risking everything for. And the suitors began to arrive. Kings and princes from every corner of Greece came to Sparta, each hoping to win Helena's hand. Odysseus came from Ithaca. Ajax came from Salamis. Diomedes, Menelaus, Patroclus, and dozens of others, some of the greatest names in Greek nobility, all converged on Sparta. Tyndareus was overwhelmed. He knew that choosing one suitor would make enemies of all the others, potentially setting off conflicts that could engulf all of Greece. Leda watched this unfold with a sick feeling in her stomach. She saw the pattern, saw how the SWAN's visit by the river all those years ago was now bearing its terrible fruit. By the time Leda reached her 60s, her hair had turned silver, and her face bore the lines of worry and secret knowledge that she had carried for decades. The great crisis she had feared was finally approaching its climax. Helena had been married to Menelaus, king of Sparta, after the clever Odysseus suggested that all the suitors swear an oath to defend Helena's chosen husband against anyone who might wrong him. It had seemed like a solution, a way to prevent the conflicts that Tyndareus had feared. For a while, there was peace. Helena seemed content with Menelaus, and the couple had a daughter, Hermione. But Leda knew better than to trust in peace where Helena was concerned. The curse of beauty, the legacy of Zeus's desire, would not be satisfied so easily. Then Paris came to Sparta. The Trojan prince was young, handsome, and charismatic. He came as a guest, as a diplomat from Troy, and was received with all the hospitality that Greek custom demanded. Menelaus, trusting and unsuspecting, welcomed Paris into his home. What happened next is etched in history as one of the greatest betrayals and tragedies of the ancient world. Whether Aphrodite truly intervened, promising Helena to Paris as a reward for judging her the fairest goddess, or whether it was simply human desire and poor judgment, the result was the same. Paris and Helena fled Sparta together, sailing for Troy with a ship full of stolen treasure. When the news reached the palace, Leda felt as though her heart would stop. This was it. This was the catastrophe she had foreseen from the moment those eggs had hatched. Menelaus was enraged, his honor destroyed, his trust betrayed. He immediately called upon all the suitors who had sworn the oath years before. The response was overwhelming. Kings and princes across Greece mobilized their armies. Ships were built, supplies gathered, weapons forged. Agamemnon, Menelaus's brother and the most powerful king in Greece, took command of the coalition. Odysseus, though reluctant, brought his Ithacon forces. Ajax brought his warriors from Salamis. Achilles, the greatest warrior of the age, was persuaded to join. Over 1,000 ships assembled at Aulis, ready to sail for Troy to retrieve Helena and punish the Trojans for their offense. Leda watched the preparations with horror. She tried to speak to the war council, to explain that Helena was not worth this bloodshed, that the whole situation had been engineered by divine machinations beyond mortal control. But her words fell on deaf ears. The wheels of fate were already in motion. The War of Troy lasted 10 years, though it felt like an eternity. News reached Sparta in fragments. Tales of battles won and lost, heroes fallen, cities burned. Leda aged rapidly during this time, the weight of guilt crushing her spirit. She had not spoken to Zeus since that day by the river, had never heard his voice or felt his presence again. He had taken what he wanted and left her to deal with the consequences, as gods always did. But the consequences were beyond anything she could have imagined. Castor and Polydeuces, her twin sons, were caught in their own tragedy. Castor, the mortal twin, was killed in a dispute over cattle rustling. Polydeuces, immortal because of his divine parentage, was grief-stricken and begged Zeus to let him share his immortality with his brother. Zeus agreed to a compromise. The twins would alternate between Olympus and the underworld, spending half their time among the gods and half among the dead, forever together but never truly alive in the mortal world. They became the constellation Gemini, eternal symbols of brotherly love. Clytemnestra, Leda's mortal daughter, married Agamemnon, the leader of the Greek forces against Troy. But that marriage, too, was cursed by the shadow of the Trojan War. When Agamemnon sacrificed their daughter Iphigenia to the goddess Artemis in exchange for favorable winds to sail to Troy, Clytemnestra's love turned to implacable hatred. She took a lover, Aegisthus, and together they plotted revenge. When Agamemnon finally returned from Troy victorious, having been gone for 10 years, Clytemnestra murdered him in his bath. She would later be killed by their son Orestes, continuing the cycle of violence. And Helena, the cause of it all, survived. The stories that came back said she had been both captive and queen in Troy, that Paris had died during the war, that she had married Paris's brother Deiphobus, that she had nearly betrayed Troy to the Greeks, or that she had remained loyal to her captors. After Troy fell, after the city burned and its people were slaughtered or enslaved, Menelaus reclaimed Helena. His intention had been to kill her for her betrayal, but when he saw her again, her beauty disarmed him as it always did. They returned to Sparta together, resuming their marriage as if the decade of war and tens of thousands of deaths had been merely an unfortunate interruption. Leda did not live to see Helena's return. She died in the 8th year of the war, worn out by grief and guilt. Her last words, whispered to a attendant who stayed by her bedside, were about the SWAN. She spoke of that afternoon by the river, of the choice that had been taken from her, of the God who had destroyed her life and the lives of so many others for a moment of divine lust. On her deathbed, Leda's mind drifted between the present and the past. The palace room where she lay was quiet except for the soft footsteps of attendants and the distant sounds of Sparta beyond the walls. She was old now, her body worn by the years and the immense weight of the secret she had carried. The attendants whispered that she was delirious, speaking of things that made no sense, but one young woman stayed close, listening to the queen's final confessions. Leda spoke of the river, of the SWAN, of the moment when everything changed. She described the feeling of divine presence, the impossibility of resistance, the knowledge that what was happening was beyond mortal comprehension or control. She spoke without anger, without bitterness, only with a profound weariness and sadness. She talked about watching her children grow, seeing the divine taint manifest in different ways in each of them. She remembered Helena's first steps, Polydeuces' first word, the way Castor and his twin were inseparable from birth. She recalled Clytemnestra's wedding to Agamemnon, the grandeur and celebration, not knowing it would lead to such tragedy. Leda wondered aloud whether she could have changed anything. If she had not gone to the river that day, would Zeus have found another way? If she had told Tyndareus the truth, would he have believed her? Would it have mattered? The gods did as they pleased, and mortals suffered the consequences. That was the way of the world. Yet even in her final moments, Leda could not bring herself to hate Zeus. It seemed pointless to hate a god, like hating a storm or an earthquake. Zeus was a force of nature, operating according to his own divine imperatives that mortals could never fully understand. What she felt instead was a deep, abiding sorrow for all the lives that had been disrupted, all the deaths that had occurred, all because a god had desired her for a moment. As her breathing became more labored, Leda's thoughts turned to the nature of beauty and desire. Helena's beauty, inherited from Zeus, had been a curse more than a blessing. It had brought her no happiness, only trouble. Men fought over her, women hated her, and she herself seemed perpetually bewildered by the chaos that surrounded her wherever she went. Was that Zeus's intention? Did he understand what he was creating when he fathered children with mortals? Or did he simply not care about the consequences? The old woman who had been Sparta's queen for so long finally let out her last breath just as the sun was setting, the same time of day when she had walked to the river all those years ago. The attendants prepared her body for burial, and all of Sparta mourned their queen. But few knew the true story, the real tragedy that had defined Leda's life. We've reached the end of this remarkable story from Greek mythology. What are your thoughts on this ancient tale of gods, mortals, and the consequences of divine desire? Do you think these myths were trying to teach us something about power and consent, or were they simply reflecting the values of their time? Share your opinion in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We have many more fascinating tales from mythology waiting to be told, stories that will make you question, reflect, and see the ancient world in a new light. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.